My daughter-in-law sold my house while I was recovering. Then she used my life savings to pay for a luxury cruise. 2 months later, she knocked on my door, asking for my guest room. She had no idea I was about to take back everything she thought she had stolen. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know who is listening to me tonight. Tell me your name. Tell me which city you're watching from. And tell me how old you are, because an old woman like me likes to imagine a face for every person who sits with her. And if you have a grandmother of your own, if you love her the way I hope my grandchildren love me, then do an old woman a favor. Press that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this with a friend who still believes family means something. Now let me tell you what my daughter-in-law did to me, and what I did back. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I am 68 years old, and until 4 months ago, I owned a house on Larkspur Lane with my own name on the deed. Paid off, mortgage-free, bought with money. I earned standing on my feet for 31 years as a hospital administrator. That house was not a gift from anyone. It was not an inheritance. It was mine, brick by brick, because I signed the papers, I made the payments, and I never once let anyone else's name touch that title. I tell you this now because you need to understand exactly what was taken from me, and exactly why what I did next was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. My son Daniel is a good man, or at least he used to be before Vanessa got her claws all the way into him. He married her 6 years ago in a wedding I paid for, in a dress I helped her choose, standing next to a mother who cried real tears because she thought her son had found someone who would take care of him the way I had. I was wrong. Vanessa did not marry my son to build a life with him. Vanessa married my son because she saw a house on Larkspur Lane, a mother-in-law with a pension and savings, and a family that did not yet know how to say no to her. It started small, the way these things always do. A birthday gift here, a loan there, a favor I never got back. I ignored it because that is what mothers do. We swallow the small insults because we do not want to lose our sons over pride. But 3 months ago, Vanessa did something no amount of swallowing could fix. And I am going to tell you every single detail, because you deserve to know exactly how far a person will go when they think an old woman is too tired to fight back. I had been staying at Daniel and Vanessa's house for 6 weeks. My hip had given me trouble that spring, a bad fall on the icy porch of my own home back in February. And my doctor did not want me living alone until I finished physical therapy. Daniel offered his guest room without hesitation, and I was grateful, truly grateful, because my son still had a good heart buried somewhere under his wife's influence. I signed a temporary power of attorney over to Daniel. Before the surgery, nothing dramatic, just standard paperwork my lawyer insisted on in case something went wrong on the operating table and decisions needed to be made quickly. I trusted my son with that power completely. I never imagined I needed to worry about his wife while I was recovering, unable to drive, unable to check my own mail without someone bringing it to me. Vanessa found the deed to my house in a folder Daniel kept in his home office. She found out the house was worth $410,000. Free and clear, no liens, no mortgage, sitting empty while I recovered 2 miles away. And instead of seeing an elderly woman's life's work, she saw a payday. I do not know exactly how she convinced Daniel to help her, whether she cried, whether she threatened to leave him, whether she simply wore him down the way water wears down, stone over years of nagging. But somehow, using that power of attorney meant only for medical emergencies. My son signed papers that listed my house for sale. It sold in 11 days. Cash offer, no contingencies, because Vanessa priced it to move fast. $40,000 under market value, because she was not trying to get me a fair price. She was trying to get her hands on money before I was back on my feet enough to stop her. I found out my house was gone on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the surgery, when a neighbor called to ask if I had met the new family moving boxes into my driveway. I remember sitting on the edge of that guest bed in Daniel's house, my hip still aching, my cane leaning against the nightstand, and I remember the sound that came out of my own mouth when I understood what she said. It was not a scream. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of something breaking that cannot be fixed with an apology. I confronted Daniel that night. He would not look at me. He kept saying it was temporary, that they needed the money for something important, that he was going to explain everything and make it right, that I would understand once I heard the whole story. And then Vanessa walked into that living room, wearing a new watch I had never seen before, and she told me, without a flicker of shame on her face, exactly where $410,000 of my life had gone. A luxury cruise. Not a modest vacation, not a family trip, not even a trip that included me. A 28-day round-the-world luxury cruise for herself and 3 of her girlfriends. First-class flights to the departure port. A private suite with a butler. Spa treatments every day at sea. Designer shopping in every port of call. And enough champagne to float a smaller boat. She showed me photographs, on her phone like she was showing me a school project she was proud of. She stood in my son's living room, having sold the house I built my entire adult life around, and she smiled while she scrolled through pictures of herself in Santorini, in Dubai, in Bali, wearing outfits that probably cost more than my monthly pension. I asked her calmly because I did not yet trust my voice not to shatter how she could do this to me. Do you know what she said? She said, and I will never forget these words as long as I live. She said, "Margaret, you are 68. You were not using that house for anything except sitting in it alone. She actually did something with the money, and I should be thanking her for giving it purpose. Giving it purpose. My house. The house where I raised Daniel. The house where his father and I built a life before cancer took him from me 11 years ago. The house that held every photograph, every piece of furniture, every memory I had left of a marriage that shaped who I am, had purpose because Vanessa got a tan in the Maldives. I did not scream at her that night. I want you to understand that about me, because what I am about to tell you is not the story of a woman who lost her temper. It is the story of a woman who went completely, perfectly calm. The way the ocean goes calm right before it decides to take something back. I moved into a small extended stay apartment the following week, using what little cash I had left in a separate account Vanessa did not know existed, an account I had kept quiet for years out of simple habit, the kind of habit a woman develops after watching too many friends get taken advantage of by people they trusted. That apartment was small, and it smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and the mattress was thin enough that I could feel the springs against my healing hip, but it was mine, and nobody could sell it out from under me while I slept. I did not call a lawyer that week to scream and demand justice, though believe me, I wanted to. I did something slower. I called my lawyer, Harold Bennett, a man who has handled my affairs for 18 years and who was, quite frankly, furious on my behalf the moment I explained what had happened. Harold told me something that changed the entire direction of what came next. He told me that a power of attorney used outside its stated scope, especially one used to sell real property without the principles, knowledge or consent, is not just unethical. It is, under the right circumstances, criminal, fraud, elder financial abuse, a category of crime that many states, including mine, prosecute aggressively, sometimes as a felony, because lawmakers finally understood how many families were doing exactly what Vanessa had done to me. Harold explained that the power of attorney I signed was explicitly limited to medical decisions during my recovery. It said nothing about property, nothing about finances, nothing about my house. Daniel had exceeded the authority I gave him, and depending on how deliberately Vanessa orchestrated the sale, she could be looking at criminal charges, not just a civil lawsuit for the return of funds. I sat in that little apartment with the thin mattress and I thought about what kind of grandmother I wanted to be. Not the kind who screams and burns every bridge in a single afternoon out of raw pain, satisfying as that might feel in the moment. I wanted to be the kind of grandmother who wins so completely and so quietly that Vanessa would spend the rest of her life understanding exactly what she lost the day she decided an old woman was an easy target. So I told Harold to prepare everything, every document, every filing, and then I told him to wait, because I was not finished collecting what I needed first. I want to tell you about the 2 months that came after, because this is the part where Vanessa made her second mistake, and her second mistake was so much bigger than her first that I Still have trouble believing a grown woman could be that careless with another person's dignity. I kept my distance from Daniel and Vanessa during those weeks. I did not scream. I did not demand. I did not even bring up the house again after that first confrontation. Instead, I went quiet, and quiet in my experience is the loudest thing a woman my age can be, because it makes people nervous. Daniel called me almost every day, apologizing in circles, telling me he was still trying to figure out how to make it right, telling me Vanessa felt terrible, though I never once heard those words come out of her own mouth. Not once, not a single apology, not a single moment where she looked at me and admitted what she had done was wrong. Instead, what I got from Vanessa during those 2 months was silence on social media, replaced by a highlight reel of the best 28 days of her life. I did not follow her accounts anymore. I had unfollowed everyone in that house the week I found out about the sale, but friends still sent me screenshots, the way friends do when they think you need to see something, or perhaps when they simply cannot resist sharing gossip that is too outrageous to keep to themselves. Vanessa on a private balcony overlooking the Amalfi Coast. Vanessa in a floor-length gown at a captain's dinner. Vanessa captioning a photograph of a $2,000 bottle of wine with the words, "Living my best life. No regrets. No regrets." As if regret was something reserved for the person whose house paid for the trip, not the person who took it. I sat with that phrase for a long time. No regrets. I decided somewhere in that little extended stay apartment with the thin mattress that Vanessa was going to learn what regret actually felt like, and she was going to learn it from a woman she thought was too old and too tired to teach her anything. Harold and I began building the case carefully. Property records showing the sale date, the sale price, and the buyer. Bank statements showing where the proceeds landed, which, as it turned out, went directly into a joint account Daniel and Vanessa shared, an account that then paid a travel agency in a single lump transfer, 11 days before departure. Text messages between Daniel and the real estate agent. Messages Daniel had never bothered to delete, in which he referenced needing to move quickly because, in his own words, my mom doesn't need to know the details yet. Just get it closed. That sentence alone told me everything. I needed to know about how deliberate this had been. This was not a spontaneous decision made in a moment of financial desperation. This was planned, sequenced, and hidden, and my own son had written the instructions in black and white. Harold also pulled something I had not expected, something that turned out to matter enormously later. The power of attorney document itself, the one I had signed before my surgery, had a clause, standard in most medical powers of attorney, explicitly limiting the agent's authority to healthcare decisions, and stating that any action outside that scope was void and unauthorized. Harold explained that this clause meant the sale of my house was not simply unethical. It was legally void from the moment it happened, because Daniel never had the authority to sign those documents in the first place. The buyers, an unsuspecting young family, named the Alvarezes, who had no idea any of this was happening, had unknowingly purchased a house through a transaction that could be unwound. I remember the exact moment Harold explained this to me over the phone, sitting at a small kitchenette table in that extended stay apartment, and I remember setting my coffee cup down very slowly, because my hands had started to shake, not from fear but from something closer to relief. I was not going to be the powerless old woman in this story. I was going to be the ending nobody saw coming. 2 months after the cruise, almost to the day, Vanessa called me. She had never called me directly in those 2 months. Not once. Always going through Daniel. Always keeping her distance the way people do when they know, somewhere underneath all that bravado, that they have done something they cannot fully justify. But that day she called me herself, and her voice was warm in a way that made my skin crawl, because I already knew, the moment I heard that particular brightness in her tone, that she wanted something. She told me she and Daniel had been thinking, and they believed it would be wonderful, truly wonderful, if I came to stay in their guest room permanently, not for 6 weeks of recovery, permanently. She said it would be good for me to have family around at my age, good for Daniel to have his mother close, good for everyone. And then, almost as an afterthought, She mentioned that they had been having some financial stress lately, unexpected expenses, and that if I moved in and contributed my monthly pension toward household costs, it would really help ease the burden while they got back on their feet. I sat there holding the phone and I understood, with a clarity I had not felt in months, exactly what was happening. Vanessa had spent $410,000 of my money on a cruise, and now that the money was gone, now that the credit card bills and whatever, debts had piled up in the aftermath were catching up to her, she wanted the next asset, my pension, my presence as free labor and free rent contribution, my guest room, not as a kindness to me, but as a resource to be extracted, the same way my house had been. I told her I needed to think about it. I told her that in a voice so calm, so pleasant, that she actually thanked me for considering it, told me she thought it was a wonderful idea, told me she would start clearing out the guest room that weekend to make space for my things. She had no idea what I was actually thinking about. I was thinking about the folder Harold had prepared, sitting in his office downtown, 3 inches thick, with every document needed to file both a civil suit for the return of my property and a criminal complaint for elder financial exploitation. I told her I would give her my answer soon, and I meant it, though not in the way she imagined. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has ever felt like the quiet one in the family, the one everyone assumes will bend, because bending is what you have always done. There is a specific kind of strength that comes from being underestimated for decades. People stop watching you closely. They stop imagining you might be 3 steps ahead, because they have decided somewhere in the back of their mind that you are simply the woman who bakes the pies and remembers the birthdays and forgives whatever needs forgiving. Vanessa made that mistake with me from the very first year of her marriage to my son. She thought sweetness was the same thing as weakness. She was about to learn the difference the hard way. The weekend after her phone call, I drove to Daniel and Vanessa's house, the same house where I had recovered from my hip surgery, the same house where I first heard the words "no regrets" fall out of her mouth like they cost nothing. I brought Harold with me, not as a lawyer that day, but simply as a family friend. Though Vanessa did not know that, the folder in his briefcase contained a formal notice of legal action that would be filed the following Monday morning if certain conditions were not met. Daniel opened the door looking thinner than I remembered, tired around the eyes in a way that told me the guilt had been eating at him even if he had not found the courage to act on it. Vanessa came down the hallway already talking, already narrating some plan about repainting the guest room, a soft sage green, already treating my visit as a formality before I moved my entire life into their home to subsidize hers. I sat down in their living room, the same living room where she had shown me photographs of Santorini, and I asked her a simple question. I asked her whether she remembered exactly what she said to me the night I found out about the house. She laughed, actually laughed, and said something about how she did not remember every conversation and I should not hold on to things so much, that dwelling on the past was not healthy at my age. That was when I told her that I remembered every word. I remembered you were not using that house for anything except sitting in it alone. I remembered I actually did something with the money. I remembered you should be thanking me for giving it purpose. And I told her, in the same calm voice I had used for months, that I had spent 2 months giving that house purpose too, and she was not going to like what that purpose turned out to be. Harold opened his briefcase. He explained in plain language exactly what the documents inside represented. A civil complaint seeking the full return of $410,000, plus interest, plus damage, to be filed against both Daniel and Vanessa jointly, since bank records showed the funds had passed, through an account held in both their names, and separately, a criminal referral prepared for the district attorney's office, detailing financial exploitation of an elderly person, a charge that in our state carries the possibility of significant prison time when the amount exceeds a certain threshold, a threshold that $410,000 cleared many times over. I watched the color drain out of Vanessa's face in real time. This was not the tearful, panicked woman I might have expected. For a moment, she simply looked stunned, The way people look when a plan that always worked before suddenly, catastrophically, does not work anymore. Daniel put his head in his hands. He kept saying my name. Mom, Mom, please, we can figure this out. Please don't do this to us. And I remember feeling something in my chest that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but some tangled version of both, because this was still my son, and watching him afraid was not something that brought me any real pleasure, even after everything. But then Vanessa said something that erased whatever softness I had left in that moment. She said sharp now, all the honey gone from her voice, that I was being dramatic, that families do not sue each other, that I would be destroying my own son's future and his credit and his marriage over money that, in her words, you weren't even using. There it was again. That phrase, as if money sitting quietly in equity, representing 31 years of my labor, was somehow less valid than money spent on champagne in international waters. I told her that families, real families, do not steal from each other and then ask for more. I told her that I had given her every opportunity, every quiet month of silence, every chance to call me herself and say the two words she had never once said, I am sorry. And instead, she had used that silence to plan her next request, my guest room, my pension, my continued usefulness to her lifestyle. I told her the paperwork would be filed Monday morning unless I heard something very different from her by Sunday night. And then Harold and I stood up and we left, and I did not look back at my son's face, because I already knew what I would see there, and I could not carry that image with me, and still do what needed to be done. Sunday night came, and my phone rang at 8:40 in the evening. It was Daniel, not Vanessa, and his voice sounded like it belonged to a much smaller version of the man I raised. He told me Vanessa had spent the entire weekend on the phone, with her own mother and with a lawyer, friend from college, trying to find some way out of what was coming, and that every single person she called had told her the same thing. There was no way out. The power of attorney was clearly limited in scope. The text messages Daniel had sent the real estate agent were damning. The money trail led directly into their joint account, and then directly into the travel agency's account, and any halfway competent prosecutor would have an easy case. Daniel asked me, voice breaking in a way that almost undid every ounce of resolve I had built over 2 months, whether there was any way to make this right without the lawsuit, without the criminal complaint, without what he kept calling destroying the family. I told him, something I had rehearsed in my head a dozen times in that little extended stay apartment. I told him the family was already destroyed the day his wife decided my life. Savings were hers to spend, and that what I was doing now was not destruction, it was accounting. I was simply presenting the bill for damage that had already been done. We talked for almost 2 hours that night. I will not pretend it was easy. There were long silences. There was crying on his end. There was a moment where he asked me if I even loved him anymore, and I told him that loving him and allowing him to keep hurting me were two completely different things, and I intended to keep doing the first while refusing, absolutely refusing, to keep doing the second. By the end of that call, Daniel had agreed to something Harold, and I had drafted as an alternative to a full criminal complaint, something Harold called a structured settlement, though I thought of it privately as simply making her pay. The terms were not gentle, and I did not want them to be gentle. Daniel and Vanessa would sign over the deed to their own home, a smaller property they owned outright in a neighboring town, transferring it fully into my name as partial repayment. They would liquidate a retirement account Vanessa had inherited from her grandmother years earlier, the one asset she had that was entirely hers and untouched by the marriage. And that money would come to me as well, and Vanessa would be required to get a job, an actual full-time job, something she had not held in the 4 years since Daniel's promotion. Made her income optional, because I refused to let her spend the next decade of her life recovering from this comfortably while I had spent the last 2 months recovering from it in a rented apartment with a mattress I could feel the springs through. If they agreed to all of it, signed and notarized within 30 days, I would withdraw the criminal referral and not pursue the civil suit further. If they refused or stalled, or tried anything clever with lawyers of their own, Harold would file everything Monday morning as planned, and Vanessa would be looking at a felony charge with her own name on it, not Daniel's, because the evidence made clear who had orchestrated the sale from the beginning. Daniel agreed that night, on the phone, his voice hollow with exhaustion. He said he would talk to Vanessa in the morning. I told him I already knew what her answer would be, because a woman who calls a $410,000 theft giving it purpose does not have much room left to negotiate once the consequences finally arrive at her own front door. I did not hear from Vanessa directly for the next 4 days. I imagine she spent that time in a state I can only describe as furious disbelief, the particular kind of anger that comes from realizing the world has rules that apply to you too, after years of believing otherwise. I heard secondhand through Daniel that she called 3 different attorneys trying to find a loophole, someone who would tell her the power of attorney was ambiguous enough to argue in her favor, someone who would tell her a mother-in-law could not really sue over family money. Every attorney she spoke with told her some version of the same thing. Harold had told me from the beginning she had no defense. The text messages alone would end any argument a jury might have needed convincing on. And once elder financial exploitation statutes get involved, judges in our state do not treat these cases lightly, especially not when the amount runs into 6 figures and the victim had a documented medical vulnerability at the exact time the crime occurred. On the 5th day, Vanessa finally called me herself. There was no honey in her voice this time. She was cold, clipped, the sound of a woman negotiating from a position she hated being in. She told me she thought the settlement terms were excessive, that giving up her inherited retirement account felt like punishing her for something her grandmother had nothing to do with, that getting a job after 4 years out of the workforce would be humiliating and difficult, that I was, in her exact words, acting like this is about justice when really it's about revenge. I told her she was half right. It was about justice. And if justice happened to feel like revenge to the person who spent someone else's life, savings on a champagne breakfast in the Maldives, then perhaps that discomfort was simply the accurate, appropriate weight of what she had done finally, landing on her shoulders instead of mine. I told her that for 2 months, I had carried the weight of losing my home while she posted photographs captioned, "No regrets." And if she wanted to talk about excessive, we could talk about excessive from the very beginning. She hung up on me that day. I remember sitting with the phone in my hand, waiting to feel guilty, waiting for that old reflex, the one that had kept me quiet through 6 years of small insults and larger ones, to come rushing back and tell me I had gone too far. It did not come. Instead, I felt something closer to peace, the specific, solid peace of a woman who has finally stopped bending for people who never once considered bending back for her. 2 days after that call, Daniel came to see me alone. He looked older than his 34 years, and he told me Vanessa had agreed to the terms, all of them, because the alternative, explained to her in blunt terms by the 3rd attorney she consulted, was the very real possibility of prison time and a permanent felony record that would follow her for the rest of her life. He told me the retirement account had already been liquidated that morning. The paperwork for the smaller house was being drawn up by Harold's office, and Vanessa had, that same afternoon, gone to 3 different retail stores and a staffing agency to start applying for work. I asked Daniel how he felt about all of it. Genuinely asked because despite everything, he was still my son, and some part of me still ached for the position he had put himself in. He told me something I did not expect. He told me that watching Vanessa scramble to fix a mess of her own making had shown him something about her he had spent 6 years refusing to see clearly, that underneath the confidence and the charm, there was a person who believed rules and consequences were things that happened to other people, and that he was not sure now that the illusion had cracked, whether their marriage could survive what it had revealed about who she really was. I did not gloat. I want you to understand that, because this is not a story about a grandmother dancing on the ashes of her son's marriage. I told Daniel that whatever happened between them was theirs to work out, but that I would not be the one bending anymore. Not for him, and certainly not for her. I told him I loved him, and that love did not mean I would ever again hand my safety, my home, or my dignity over to someone who thought no regrets was an acceptable thing to say to the woman she had robbed. The paperwork closed within 3 weeks. I now own a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from where Larkspur Lane used to be mine, a house that used to belong to my son and his wife. And I will admit there is a strange, complicated feeling in owning a home that was once the backdrop for so much of my humiliation. But it is mine now, deeded, filed, notarized, sitting in my name the way Larkspur Lane once did, and no power of attorney signed under duress or confusion will ever touch it, because Harold made certain this time that every document was airtight, reviewed twice, witnessed properly, with no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit. The retirement account, once liquidated and taxed, came to just under $90,000, which Harold placed directly into a trust in my name, one that Daniel cannot access, one that Vanessa will never see a cent of no matter what happens to her marriage. It is not the full $410,000 my house was worth. I know that, and I have made peace with the arithmetic of it, because I understood from the beginning that getting every dollar back was less important to me than making certain Vanessa understood, in a way she could never again pretend not to understand, that actions like hers come with a price too steep to shrug off with a smile and a hashtag. The job hunt did not go the way Vanessa expected either. 4 years out of the workforce, combined with a resume that had grown thin and outdated, meant the wonderful opportunity she had once imagined for herself, some glamorous role befitting the woman who redecorated guest rooms and planned round-the-world cruises, simply did not exist for her anymore. She started eventually at a retail management position 40 long hours a week, on her feet the way I had been on my feet for 31 years, except she was starting at the bottom of a ladder. I had already climbed and descended by the time I was her age. I heard through Daniel that the adjustment humbled her in ways nothing else had, that coming home exhausted after a 9-hour shift folding clothes and dealing with difficult customers gave her a great deal of time to reconsider what purpose actually meant, and whether spending someone else's life savings on a cruise had truly given her house any purpose worth the cost. I moved into my new home on a Saturday morning in early spring, and I remember standing in the empty living room, sunlight coming through windows that were, for the first time in months, entirely and legally mine, and I thought about the woman who had sat on the edge of a guest bed months earlier, hearing the sound of her own life breaking. That woman had not disappeared, not exactly, but she had grown a spine strong enough to carry everything that came after, and I found I liked the woman standing in that empty living room a great deal more than I expected to. Daniel visits me now once a week, sometimes with flowers, sometimes just with conversation, rebuilding something between us slowly, the way you rebuild anything that has been badly damaged, one honest brick at a time. Vanessa has not visited. I do not expect her to, and I have made my peace with that too. Some relationships, once broken in a particular way, are not meant to be repaired into their old shape. They are meant to teach you what you will and will not accept moving forward, and I have accepted that Vanessa taught me that lesson at a cost I would never have chosen, but a lesson I am, strangely, grateful to have learned before it was too late to do anything about it. I think about the guest room often, the one Vanessa wanted to repaint sage green for me, the one she offered as though it were a gift instead of a trap disguised as generosity. I think about how close I came, in a moment of exhaustion and grief, to saying yes to moving my pension and my presence and my remaining dignity into a house that had already proven it would sell my life out from under me the moment it became inconvenient. I think about what would have happened to a woman who agreed to that arrangement, who kept giving and giving until there was nothing left to take. And I understand now that saying no to that guest room was not cruelty. It was the first act of self-respect I had shown myself in longer than I care to admit. If you are listening tonight and you recognize any part of yourself in this story, if you have ever been the quiet one, the one everyone assumed would bend, the one whose kindness got mistaken for weakness by people, who should have known better. I want you to hear this from an old woman who learned it the hard way. Being kind and being a doormat are not the same thing. You are allowed to love your family and still refuse to let them take everything from you. You are allowed to forgive, eventually in your own time, without ever again handing over the keys to your own safety. I forgave Daniel slowly, the way you forgive someone who was weak rather than cruel, someone who let himself be led into a mistake he is still paying for in ways beyond the financial. I have not forgiven Vanessa, not fully, and I am not certain I ever will, and I have decided that is allowed too. Forgiveness is not owed to everyone simply because they eventually face consequences. Sometimes the consequences themselves are the only closure a person like that will ever earn from you, and that has to be enough because it is all I am willing to give. My house on Larkspur Lane is gone. I drive past it sometimes, and I see the Alvarez family's swing set in the backyard where mine used to sit empty, and I feel mostly at peace because that family did nothing wrong. They bought a home in good faith, and I would never wish my grief onto people who had no part in causing it. What I lost cannot be undone completely, but what I built afterward, the trust, the new home, the spine I did not know I still had at 68 years old, that is entirely mine, earned in the same slow, steady way I earned everything else in my life. Nobody can sell that out from under me. Nobody can call it giving something purpose while they take it away. It is simply mine, the way it should have been from the very beginning. Let me go back and tell you something I skipped, because I think you need the full picture of who Vanessa was before all of this. Not just the version who sold my house, but the years of small moments that should have warned me long before Larkspur Lane was ever at risk. I mentioned the birthday gifts, the loans, the favors never returned, and I want to walk you through a few of them now, because pattern matters. And I did not see the pattern clearly until it was almost too late. 3 years into their marriage, Vanessa asked to borrow $8,000 for what she called an emergency, a word she used with a gravity that suggested medical crisis or job loss, something urgent and unavoidable. I gave it to her without hesitation, the way a mother gives, without asking too many questions. When her son's wife says the word emergency, I found out 4 months later, through a slip of the tongue from Daniel during a casual conversation about their upcoming anniversary, that the emergency had been a designer handbag collection. Vanessa felt she needed to keep up appearances with a new friend group she had recently joined, women whose husbands made considerably more money than mine ever had. She never repaid that loan. She never mentioned it again, and when I gently brought it up once, almost 2 years later, she looked at me with genuine confusion, as though the request itself had been so long ago, it no longer counted as a debt owed. There was also the Christmas 2 years ago when I spent $400 on a coat for Vanessa, a coat she had mentioned wanting in front of me weeks earlier, wool camel-colored from a boutique downtown. She opened it, thanked me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and I later learned from Daniel that she had returned it the following week and used the store credit to ward something else entirely, never telling me, never even pretending to wear it once for a family photograph. Small things. I told myself they were small things, the kind of small things every family absorbs and forgives because dwelling on them would make holidays unbearable. Looking back now, I understand that each of these small moments was Vanessa, testing the boundaries of what she could take without consequence, the way water tests the edges of a container before it finds the crack it can widen. My house was never really the first thing she took. It was simply the largest, the moment the water finally found a crack big enough to flood through completely. I think about my late husband sometimes during all of this. My Robert gone 11 years now, and I wonder what he would have said watching all of it unfold. Robert was a quiet man, not given to dramatic gestures, but he had a particular kind of clarity about people that I always admired and occasionally resented, because he saw things about people faster than I did, and he was rarely wrong. I remember him meeting Vanessa for the first time, at a dinner Daniel arranged before they were even engaged, and I remember Robert being polite, warm even, but quiet in the car afterward, in a way that told me he was turning something over in his mind. He never said anything critical of her, not directly, not in the entire year before his diagnosis changed everything else in our lives. But I have wondered many times since whether he saw, even then, the shape of what was coming, and simply chose not to burden a son who was already happily in love with a warning that might not have changed anything anyway. I built that house on Larkspur Lane with Robert over 11 years of marriage before he passed, and I lived in it alone for 11 years after, keeping his study exactly as he left it, his reading glasses still on the desk, his handwriting still visible in the margins of the books he loved. When Vanessa sold that house, she did not just sell 4 walls and a roof. She sold the last physical space, where I could stand in a room and still feel close to my husband, where I could sit in his study and remember, in a way memory alone can never fully replicate, what it felt like to build a life next to someone who loved me steadily for 37 years. I did not tell her this during our confrontation. I did not tell her about Robert's study, about his glasses, about the particular slant of afternoon light that used to fall across his desk every day around 4 o'clock. I did not tell her because I did not believe, even then, that she would have understood the weight of it, and I refused to hand her one more piece of myself to dismiss with a phrase like, "You weren't using it anyway." Some things are too precious to offer to someone who has already proven she cannot hold precious things with any care. There is a friend of mine, Carol, who lived 2 doors down from me on Larkspur Lane for 19 years, and I want to tell you about the day she called me, because it says something about how quickly this kind of loss becomes public in a small neighborhood, and how quickly people rally around you when they finally understand what actually happened. Carol had watched the moving truck arrive at what used to be my driveway, watched the Alvarez family unload boxes and furniture into a house she had visited 100 times over nearly 2 decades, and she assumed, reasonably, that I had simply decided to downsize and sell on my own, perhaps to be closer to Daniel during my recovery. She called to wish me well in the new chapter, cheerful, warm, the way old friends are when they believe good news is coming. I remember the silence on the line after I explained what had actually happened. Carol did not say anything for what felt like a full 10 seconds, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed entirely, gone hard and protective, in a way that reminded me why our friendship had lasted as long as it had. She told me she wanted to drive over immediately, and she did, arriving at my extended stay apartment within the hour with a casserole she had apparently made for someone else's family and simply redirected toward mine, because Carol has never once shown up anywhere empty-handed in the 30 years I have known her. Carol sat with me at that little kitchenette table for 3 hours that evening, and she told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that she had watched, over the years, the way Vanessa spoke to me at family gatherings, the small dismissals, the eye rolls when I mentioned something about my late husband, the way she would talk over me in conversations as though my opinion mattered less simply because I had lived longer. Carol said she had wanted to say something for years but did not feel it was her place, and she apologized for staying quiet, and I told her there was nothing to apologize for, because I had stayed quiet too, far longer than she had, and I was the one who had the most reason to speak up. It was Carol, actually, who first mentioned Harold Bennett to me, though I had already been his client for years by that point for unrelated matters. Small estate planning documents, the will I updated after Robert passed. Carol reminded me in her blunt and practical way that Harold had helped her own sister through a difficult situation with a business partner who had tried something similarly underhanded, and she told me, in words I still remember clearly, that I did not need to decide immediately whether to fight, but I owed it to myself to at least understand what fighting would look like before I decided, to simply accept what had happened and move on quietly. That conversation with Carol was, in many ways, the turning point that led me to call Harold the following morning, instead of simply grieving in silence the way I might have a few years earlier before I had learned, through loss and age and the slow accumulation of experience, that grief and action are not mutually exclusive. You can mourn something and still fight to reclaim what pieces of it can be reclaimed. I did both, simultaneously for months, and I do not think either one made the other any less real. I want to also tell you about the physical therapy sessions I continued, attending twice a week during all of this, because my hip did not stop needing care simply, because my life had been upended. In every other way, my physical therapist, a patient young man named Peter, who had no idea about any of the family drama unfolding around his sessions with me, once asked why I seemed distracted during our exercises, and I found myself, almost against my own judgment, telling him a shortened version of what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, then told me something that stuck with me through the rest of the ordeal. He said that, in his experience working with older patients recovering from injuries, the ones who healed fastest were rarely the ones who avoided all stress and conflict, but the ones who found something worth fighting for during their recovery, something that gave their body a reason to get strong again. I did not fully understand what he meant until months later, standing in the empty living room of my new home, legs steady beneath me, hip fully healed, having spent the entire recovery period not just rebuilding my body but rebuilding my life around a fight I refused to lose. Let me take you back into that living room the day Harold and I brought the folder, because I skipped over some of the details in my rush to tell you the outcome, and I think the smaller moments matter just as much as the larger ones. When Harold opened his briefcase, the room went completely silent except for the sound of a clock ticking on the mantel, a clock Daniel and Vanessa had received as a wedding gift from Robert and me all those years ago. An irony I noticed even in that tense moment and could not help but sit with for a beat longer than necessary. Vanessa picked up the civil complaint document first, scanning it quickly, her eyes moving fast across the page, the way people read when they are looking for an escape, rather than actually absorbing information. I watched her lips move, slightly as she read the dollar figure, listed in the damages section, $410,000 plus statutory interest, plus attorney fees, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, the first genuine crack in the composure she had worn like armor since the day I found out about the sale. She looked up at me and asked, voice tighter than before, whether I actually intended to send my own son's wife to prison. I told her that intention was the wrong word. I told her that I intended to hold her accountable, and that whether accountability led to prison was a decision that would ultimately belong to a judge and jury, not to me, and that the decision she needed to make right now was whether she wanted to give them the opportunity to make that decision at all, or whether she wanted to resolve this the way Harold had outlined, quietly, privately, without a single reporter or courtroom spectator ever hearing the words luxury cruise and elder financial exploitation in the same sentence. That last detail, I noticed, seemed to land harder than any of the financial terms. Vanessa cared deeply about appearances, about the image she projected to her friend group, to her social media followers, to the women she had brought on that cruise in the first place. The idea of a public criminal case, her name printed in a local paper's court blotter, her friends discovering exactly how she had funded that 28-day trip, seemed to frighten her in a way the abstract financial numbers had not fully managed to. Daniel, for his part, sat completely still through most of this exchange, staring at the coffee table, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression I can only describe as a mixture of shame and something almost like relief, as though some part of him had been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally hold a line he had not been strong enough to hold himself. I remember thinking, watching my son sit there in that particular posture of defeat, that I had perhaps failed him in some way too, raised him to be agreeable rather than principled, taught him through my own decades of quiet accommodation that keeping the peace mattered more than protecting what was right. I do not know if that is entirely fair to myself. Parents cannot control every choice their grown children make, but I have sat with that question many nights since, turning it over, the way you turn over a stone, looking for what might be living underneath. Before Harold and I left that day, Vanessa asked me one more question, and it is the question I think about most often when I reflect on everything that happened. She asked me why I was doing this now, after months of staying quiet, after seeming, in her words, like you'd accepted it and moved on. I told her the truth. I told her I had not moved on. I told her I had simply been building, quietly, methodically, the way I had built everything worthwhile in my life, one careful step at a time, because I had learned, a long time ago, that the loudest reaction is rarely the most effective one. I told her that the 2 months of silence she mistook for surrender were actually the 2 months I spent making absolutely certain that when I finally acted, there would be no gap in my case wide enough for her to slip through. She did not have a response to that. For the first time since I had known her, 6 years of birthdays and holidays and small dismissive comments, Vanessa Whitfield had nothing to say. The day everything was finally signed and notarized, I asked Harold to meet me at his office rather than at Daniel and Vanessa's house, because I did not want the final act of this entire ordeal to happen in a space still tangled up with so many painful memories. I wanted clean walls, a conference table that had never hosted a family argument, a room with no history attached to it at all. Vanessa arrived 15 minutes late, dressed more plainly than I had ever seen her. No designer handbag, no new watch, just a simple blouse and slacks that I suspected, though I never asked, might have come from the same retail store where she had recently started working. She sat across from me at that conference table, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she looked directly at me, not with defiance, not with the practiced charm she used to wear so easily, but with something closer to exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent weeks running every possible angle and found, at the end of all of it, that there was no angle left to run. She signed the deed transfer first, her signature smaller and more hesitant than the confident scrawl I remembered from her wedding guest book 6 years earlier. She signed the documentation for the liquidated retirement account next, and I watched her hand pause for just a moment over that particular page, and I understood watching that hesitation that this was the one piece of the settlement, that it cost her something beyond money, something that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman Vanessa had genuinely loved, and I felt for just a moment something almost like sympathy, quickly overtaken by the memory of exactly how she had described my own life's work as something with no purpose, until she gave it one. When the paperwork was finished, Harold gathered the documents into neat, orderly stacks, and the room fell into an uncomfortable quiet. Vanessa stood to leave, and then, unexpectedly, she turned back toward me at the doorway. She said quietly that she was sorry, not elaborate, not tearful, not performed the way I might have expected from a woman who had built so much of her identity around performance. Just 2 words, said plainly, the first time I had heard them from her in the entire 8 months since this began. I told her I appreciated hearing it, and I meant that, but I also told her that an apology arriving only after every legal and financial consequence had already been fully enforced meant something different than an apology offered freely, out of genuine remorse, before any of this had become unavoidable. I told her I hoped, sincerely, that she used this experience to become a different kind of person than the one who stood in Daniel's living room 8 months earlier, scrolling through vacation photographs while an old woman absorbed the loss of everything she had built. Whether she did or did not become that different person was, I told her, entirely up to her from that point forward, and no longer something I needed to manage, worry over, or wait for. She left, and I have not seen her since, though Daniel tells me she is still working at that same retail position, still in the smaller house that used to be theirs and is now legally mine, paying me rent now, modest but consistent, the way any tenant would, because I offered to let them stay there under a proper lease, rather than displacing them entirely into the street, a mercy I gave not because she deserved it, but because I refused to let this entire experience turn me into someone who took pleasure in causing homelessness, even for a person who had shown me so little consideration in return. There is a difference, I have learned, between justice and cruelty, and I was determined, throughout every part of this, to stay firmly on the correct side of that line, even when the other side might have felt in certain private moments, deeply satisfying. I have 2 grandchildren, Daniel and Vanessa's children, a boy named Jack who is 9, and a girl named Emma who just turned 6. And I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Jack a few weeks after everything was finally settled. Because children, I have found, often understand fairness more clearly than adults do, before the world teaches them to complicate it with excuses and rationalization. Jack asked me during one of our weekly visits why he did not live in the big house on Larkspur Lane anymore, the one he remembered visiting for holidays when he was younger. I told him, in terms simple enough for a 9-year-old to understand without frightening him, that his mother had made a mistake with money that belonged to me, and that mistakes, even big ones, come with consequences, and that everyone in a family, no matter how much they love each other, has to be responsible for the choices they make. Jack thought about this for a long moment, the way children do when they are turning something serious over in their minds. And then he said something that I have carried with me since. He said, "So you're not mad at us? You're just making sure it's fair." I told him that was exactly right, and I hugged him. And I thought, not for the first time, that if a 9-year-old could grasp the difference between revenge and fairness so easily, there was no excuse for the adults in his life to have struggled with that same distinction for as long as they did. I have thought often since that conversation with Jack about what it means to raise the next generation of this family with a clearer understanding of fairness than the one Daniel and Vanessa apparently grew up with. I make a point now, during our weekly visits, of letting Jack see me pay my own bills, manage my own finances, make my own decisions about the new house without asking permission from anyone. Small, ordinary things that most children never think twice about, but things I want him to absorb as simply normal, so that when he is grown, he understands instinctively that respecting an elder means respecting their autonomy, not managing it away the moment it becomes inconvenient or profitable to do so. Emma is too young to understand any of this yet, and I am grateful for that. Grateful that she gets to grow up in whatever version of this family manages to rebuild itself in the years ahead, without carrying the weight of exactly how close her grandmother came to losing everything her grandfather and I built together over a lifetime. When she is older, when she asks her own questions the way Jack has already started to, I hope Daniel finds the courage to tell her the truth plainly, without softening it into something more comfortable. Because children deserve honesty about the family they belong to, even the difficult parts, especially the difficult parts, since those are usually the parts that teach the most lasting lessons. I hope, by the time she is old enough to ask questions, that the answer she receives is simply that her family went through something difficult and came out the other side more honest than before, rather than the raw, painful details of exactly how that honesty was earned. I sit now, most evenings, in the living room of my new home, in a chair that once belonged to Robert, one of the few pieces of furniture I managed to retrieve from storage before Larkspur Lane sold. And I think about how strange it is that a woman can spend 68 years being underestimated and then discover, in the span of a single devastating year, exactly how much strength was sitting quietly underneath all that patience the entire time. I do not think Vanessa will ever fully understand what she taught me about myself, because understanding that would require her to first understand what she took, and I am not certain she has fully reckoned with that yet. Working her retail shifts, paying her modest rent, living in a smaller house than the life she once imagined for herself. But I understand it. I understand that the woman who sat quietly through years of small dismissals, who gave loans that were never repaid and coats that were quietly returned for store credit, who absorbed insult after insult because that is what mothers and mothers-in-law are taught to do. That woman is gone now, replaced by someone who knows exactly what she is worth and refuses, absolutely refuses, to let anyone convince her otherwise ever again. If that is the one gift Vanessa accidentally gave me in the middle of everything she took, then perhaps in some strange and complicated way, there was a kind of purpose in all of it after all. Just not the purpose she meant when she said those words to me in Daniel's living room, standing there with a stolen watch on her wrist and a suitcase full of vacation photographs, thinking an old woman would simply absorb the loss and stay quiet, the way she always had before. I did not stay quiet, and I never will again. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before I close this story tonight. Something Harold said to me during our very last meeting in his office, after the final documents had been filed and stamped and archived, after months of careful, deliberate work had finally reached their conclusion. He told me that in 18 years of handling cases like mine, the clients who healed fastest afterward were never the ones who got every single dollar back, because full restitution in cases like this is rare and often impossible to fully achieve no matter how strong the evidence. The clients who healed fastest, he said, were the ones who stopped needing the other person to admit they were wrong and started trusting their own certainty instead. I did not fully understand what he meant in that moment, sitting across from him with the last folder of paperwork closed between us. But I understand it now, months later, sitting in Robert's old chair in a house that is entirely, legally, permanently mine. Healing, I have learned, is rarely a single dramatic moment where everything suddenly feels resolved. It is a long series of small, quiet choices made over and over to keep standing firmly in your own truth, even when nobody else in the room seems willing to admit it out loud. I did not need Vanessa's apology to know I was right. I did not need Daniel's guilt to validate what I had lost. I simply needed to know, in the quiet and honest center of myself, that a woman who worked 31 years for everything she built does not owe anyone an explanation for refusing to let it be taken from her twice. That certainty is what carried me through the extended stay, apartment with the thin mattress, through the 2 months of silence while Vanessa posted photographs from the Maldives, through the conference table where I watched her sign away pieces of the life she had built on top of the life she took from me. That certainty is what let me stay calm instead of cruel, firm instead of vengeful, patient instead of desperate, all the way through to the end. I think about aging sometimes, about what it means to be 68 years old in a world that often treats women my age as though our usefulness has an expiration date stamped somewhere on our birth certificates. Vanessa was not the first person in my life to underestimate what a woman my age is capable of. And I suspect she will not be the last person any of you encounter who makes that same mistake, whether it is a daughter-in-law, a co-worker, a stranger who assumes slower steps mean a slower mind. I hope, if you take nothing else from this story tonight, you take this simple truth with you. Carry it into whatever room in your own life needs to hear it most. Age does not erode resolve. If anything, it sharpens it, tempers it, teaches it patience it did not have in younger years. Patience that looks, to people who do not understand it, like weakness, right up until the moment it does not anymore. Now tell me before you go, where are you watching this from tonight? Type your city in the comments below, and tell me your name too, because I read every single one of them myself, late at night with a cup of tea, and I love knowing how far these stories travel to reach someone who might need to hear them tonight. And if you love your grandmother, if she taught you even half of what mine taught me, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who still believes that quiet, patient women are not to be underestimated. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never let anyone convince you that your years of quiet patience were ever a weakness instead of the deepest strength you carried all along. I will see you in the next story.